Hercule Poirot and the Woman Who Swore. Twice differently. Chapter 1. The Contradictory Oath. It was a damp spring afternoon when Inspector Gaston Lemaire received the call from the Château de Vezancy, a stately estate on the edge of the Saône valley, famous for its symmetrical gardens and its collection of family portraits, all stern and watchful in their gilded frames. The inspector initially thought it was a simple domestic dispute between the de la Fontaines, one of those old aristocratic families who cling to decorum like a crumbling banner. But it only took 10 minutes inside the tapestry room to know that there was nothing ordinary about what had just happened. Madame Arielle de la Fontaine, the young second wife of the late Baron Etienne de la Fontaine, had just given 2 radically different accounts of the same night. The first time she spoke, through tears and with her hands clasped around her linen handkerchief. She claimed that she had been alone in her bedroom when the shot rang out from the library. 3 hours later, without any prompting, she solemnly swore that she had in fact gone downstairs minutes before the shot and had seen someone hurrying away from the scene of the crime, someone she could not or would not identify. Baron Etienne's body still lay in the library, slumped in his favourite armchair, an antique revolver lying beside him, and a small unfinished glass of brandy. Nothing about the scene suggested a struggle. The window was closed, the door unforced. The gun belonged to the Baron himself. His lawyer, the nervous Monsieur Duclos, had already murmured that it was suicide. But Lemaire wasn't so easily convinced. What suicide drinks half a drink and leaves footprints in front of the fireplace? And why change the story twice, as Madame Arielle had done? 3 more people were in the house that night. Margot de la Fontaine, the Baron's daughter from his first marriage, a severe young woman with a sharp face and a watchful gaze. Dr. Emilien Rousseau, family physician and confidant, with gentle manners and strong opinions. And finally, the Baron's second cousin, Monsieur Armand de la Fontaine, a down-and-out bon vivant, known more for his gambling in Lyon than for his family ties. They all had a reason to be there, and each maintained they hadn't heard the shot until the maid, on the verge of collapse, screamed from the hallway. It was Margot who, in a dry outburst of voice, said, "This is a farce. No one here will tell the truth, not even the one who claims to know it." And it was then, when the atmosphere in the chateau was beginning to become unbreathable, that Lemaire made the call. 2 days later, under a leaden sky that seemed to regard the world with skepticism, a small man with a perfectly ironed suit and a moustache worthy of architecture arrived in Vezancy. Hercule Poirot, the famous Belgian detective, stepped off the train with his trusty leather briefcase and an expression of polite disdain for the mud that flecked the rural station. "Mademoiselle, there is no greater crime than allowing one's shoes to lose their symmetry," he said gravely to the station attendant, while wiping every invisible stain from his footwear with a handkerchief. Upon arriving at the chateau, Poirot didn't immediately ask any questions. He first walked through the wonderfully unkempt garden, inspected the facade without a word, and then sat down in the drawing-room, where everyone seemed to be holding their breath. In a soft but authoritative voice, he asked, "Who was the first to see the Baron's body?" They all looked at each other until Arielle, in a small voice, murmured, "Me. It was me. The first time I went down, Poirot raised an eyebrow, barely. He said nothing. The first time, he said finally, as if it were a word he'd found lying among the furniture Ariel swallowed. No one in the room moved. I was wrong. I meant I went down there once, but I was confused. It was a very difficult time. Poirot nodded very slowly, without taking his eyes off her. Naturally. Emotions cause us to stumble upon the truth, mademoiselle, but with your permission, I don't stumble. At the end of that afternoon, Poirot examined the library. He delicately touched the spines of the books, observed the exact placement of the brandy glass, and measured the distance between the armchair and the fireplace with a small ruler. Then, without warning, he asked to see the Baron's will. Monsieur Duclos, somewhat pale, handed it over without protest. Poirot read it silently. Then he stood up and turned to Lemaire. "My friend, do you think the widow might be lying? Not to protect herself, but to protect someone else?" "Who?" the inspector asked. "That, sir, is what we are going to discover." And in his gaze shone the promise of a truth far more tangled than anyone present was willing to admit. Chapter 2. The Circle of Suspects. The next morning dawned shrouded in a fine mist that crept over the chateau's gates, as if it too wanted to spy on what was happening inside. Hercule Poirot, impeccable as ever, ate his breakfast alone on a small side terrace. From there he could see the library, on whose carpet the outline of the Baron's body still lingered, marked with grey threads by the local police. At 10 o'clock, Poirot asked to speak to each of those present, starting with Margot de la Fontaine. The young woman entered the room as if it belonged to her. Her bearing was upright, her gestures measured. She wore an unadorned black dress, and there was not a trace of tears on her face. When Poirot offered her a seat, she declined it with a shake of her head. "I don't need to sit down. I'm perfectly fine, mademoiselle. I don't doubt your strength. But the human soul, even when it's not crying, can waver. A seat can be an ally in moments of truth," Poirot said with a slight smile. Margot sat down. Her gaze, however, didn't soften. "What was your relationship with your father like, mademoiselle?" "Complicated," she replied without hesitation. "My father was a stern man, demanding. He didn't appreciate weakness, either in himself or in others. I tried hard to please him. I didn't always succeed." Poirot nodded. "And with Mrs. Ariel?" Margot clenched her jaw. She was convenient. A young wife to distract him from his old age. Although she distracted him more with her tears than with her conversation. "Did you dislike it?" "No, but I didn't respect her. There's a difference." Poirot tilted his head slightly, recording each word as if it were a move on a chessboard. "Where were you last night between 9 and 10? "In my room, writing letters. You can confirm with Madame Laurette, the maid. She brought me tea at 9:30. "Thank you, mademoiselle. Your answers are comfortingly clear." Margot left without adding a word. The second to be called was Dr. Emilien Rousseau, a middle-aged man with a serene face, a close-cropped beard, and a voice modulated like that of a lecturer. He greeted Poirot politely and sat down immediately. "Monsieur Poirot, it's an honour. I've followed your cases with admiration for years. I confess I never imagined seeing you here, within these walls, under these circumstances." Poirot thanked him with a slight gesture. "Doctor, you were close to the Baron. How would you describe him?" "A man scarred by the loss of his first wife. Rigid in his principles, but not lacking in sensitivity, though he never admitted it." "And your health?" The doctor lowered his voice, as if his words could still reach the deceased. "Physically, strong as an oak. Mentally, more fragile. He suffered from insomnia and anxiety. I treated him discreetly. No formal diagnosis, but he hadn't been the same for months." "Were you suffering from hallucinations? Suicidal thoughts?" "He never confessed anything like that to me. But his gaze, there was a shadow, as if he was waiting for something or someone to fall on him." Poirot watched him for a few seconds. "Where were you at the time of the crime?" "In the music room, reviewing some documents. I was alone." "Convenient, but not confirmable," murmured Poirot. The doctor smiled without taking offence. "I'm afraid so." Next up was Armand de la Fontaine. He showed up wearing a slightly wrinkled jacket and a smile that tried to be charming, but hid a slight tremor in his fingers. "Monsieur Poirot, a pleasure, though I regret the circumstances. My cousin Etienne. Well, we weren't exactly close, but he was blood of my blood." "What are you currently doing, Mr. Armand?" "To survive, mainly. I've had better times. Let's just say I'm between projects." Poirot did not smile. "Did you have reasons to wish the Baron dead?" Armand choked on his own laughter. "Me? My God, of course not. Etienne supported me with a small income. Without him the ropes are taut." "Interesting. So his death doesn't benefit you?" "Not directly. Although I suppose Margot will inherit everything. And if she's generous, there might still be a place for me." Poirot said nothing, but jotted something down in his notebook. "Where were you last night?" "Playing chess with Madame Ariel, until she excused herself to go upstairs. Afterward, I went to smoke in the greenhouse. Alone, I'm afraid." Poirot nodded. "Alone. Again." The last to be interviewed was Ariel. She looked pale, wearing a pearl-grey dress, and her hair was tied back in a low bun. She had the expression of someone walking a tightrope. "Madam, yesterday you offered 2 different versions of events. Will you help us understand why today?" Ariel swallowed. "I didn't mean to lie. Just protect myself." "Of what, exactly?" "Of myself." Poirot waited, motionless as a china clock. "I saw something," she said finally. "I don't know if I imagined it. I went downstairs, before the shot. I heard voices, 2 men. One was Etienne, the other, I don't know. When I went in, he was already dead. I got scared. I went up, and I said I hadn't come downstairs. It was instinct. And then, afterwards, I couldn't take it any more. I changed my statement, but no one believes me any more." Poirot looked at her for a long time, in silence. "Madame, sometimes the truth isn't found in the words themselves, but in the order in which they're spoken. You've said yours twice. I'll find out which one was true." And so, with each piece gently placed on the board, Poirot closed his notebook and looked out the window. Outside, the fog was beginning to dissipate, but at the chateau, the mystery was only beginning to thicken. Chapter 3. The First Shadow of Suspicion. As evening fell, a dull atmosphere seemed to envelop the Château de Vezancy. Sunbeams filtered through the high windows as if reluctant to enter. Poirot, sitting in the now deserted library, observed every corner with silent attention. The fireplace was no longer burning, but it still retained the faint scent of wood, smoke. In front of him, on the small oak table next to the Baron's armchair, lay the brandy glass, still with a finger's worth of the liquor intact. Poirot hadn't touched it. He didn't need physical evidence, only mental clues. It was then that Inspector Lemaire returned with the requested reports. He held a thin envelope in his hands, his expression a mixture of irritation and respect. "Penny, tests confirm the obvious," he said, dropping the envelope onto the table. "The gun had the Baron's fingerprints on it. There are no signs of a struggle. Everything points to suicide." Poirot didn't reply immediately. He took the envelope delicately and examined it without opening it. And the glass? Just his fingerprints. Etienne's, nothing else. No traces of sleeping pills. No toxins. Nothing. Poirot closed his eyes for a few seconds. "And yet, mon ami, something doesn't fit. The symmetry is broken." "Symmetry? Oui. Look around. Do you see how the chairs, the books, even the objects on the mantelpiece are arranged? The Baron was a man of routine, obsessed with order. Yet that small rug is crooked. The book lying on the arm of the chair is upside down. And that glass," he indicated the brandy, "is placed exactly 3 centimetres from its usual place, as evidenced by the circular imprint on the wood. Everything indicates an act beyond his control. Are you implying that he was forced? Not physically forced, no, but perhaps guided, manipulated." Lemaire frowned. And who would do something like that? Someone who knew how to induce him without arousing suspicion. Someone who understood the Baron's mind better than anyone. Or perhaps someone the Baron I feared in silence. Poirot then asked to speak to the maid, Madame Lorette, a robust woman, her hair pinned with brass clips and hands hardened by years of silent labour. At first she was reluctant to speak more than necessary, but a gesture from Poirot was enough to make her lower her voice. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, his eyes lowered, "I don't know if I should say this, but the Baron wasn't the man everyone thought he was. In what sense? He was strict, very strict, with everyone. But with Madame Margot, it was different. Not like a father. Not always, at least." Poirot raised an eyebrow slowly. "Are you implying something inappropriate? I didn't see anything. I just heard arguments, crying. And one night, she ran out of the office with a red face and a scarred cheek." Poirot did not react with scandal, but with a slight nod. "And did you report it to anyone?" "Who, monsieur?" "No one here listens to the maids. And Margot never mentioned it. She just said she was cold, and locked herself in her room." Poirot remained silent. Then he asked, "Who was the person who had free access to the Baron's office? Besides him, only Dr. Rousseau. And, well, Madame Ariel, of course. And Cousin Armand." The maid snorted. "He could barely find the kitchen, monsieur. He wasn't allowed to loiter on the upper floors." Poirot smiled, gently. "Thank you, Madame Lorette. You've been more helpful than you think." Going out into the garden at dusk, Poirot walked alone under the less carefully tended trees than he would have approved. There he found Ariel, sitting by a stone fountain where goldfish swam, unaware that someone had died within those walls. She was holding an open book, but not reading it. "Are you coming to question me again, Monsieur Poirot?" "No, madame, I'm coming to notice and listen to what you want to say, not what I demand." She closed the book. "The truth doesn't always set you free, you know. Sometimes it only condemns those who are still alive. But without truth, madame, justice stumbles in the dark." She sighed. Then, without looking at him directly, she murmured, "Margot, she hasn't been the same since her mother died. She changed. She came back harder, colder, and sometimes I felt like she hated me just for breathing the same air as her. Has he ever threatened you? Not with words, but the look in his eyes. I can't explain it. Sometimes I think he would have liked to see me disappear." Poirot bowed slightly. "Hate isn't a crime, madame, but the silence that surrounds it, it can be." That night, while everyone was asleep, Poirot sat at the late Baron's desk, wearing gloves. He searched the drawers, flipping through each letter, each entry, page by page. Finally, he found what he was looking for, a half-written letter, dated 2 days before his death. The pen had stopped on an incomplete sentence. "If anything happens to me, don't look to the enemies. Look inside my house, because—" The ink had dried before finishing. Poirot slowly closed the letter and muttered to himself, "The truth is not hidden in darkness, but in the reflection it projects." And as he left the office, he already had a new address in mind. A figure was beginning to emerge in the mosaic of the crime. It wasn't yet a certainty, but the shadow had already lengthened over one of them. Chapter 4. The Alibi That Couldn't Hold Up with the Mirror. The next morning's sun shone coldly through the stained glass windows of the main corridor of the Château de Vezancy. That place, once full of ancestral dignity, was beginning to look to Poirot like a stage set with too many broken mirrors. Each reflection offered a different image of the truth. Poirot, after a night of voluntary insomnia and mental analysis, requested an immediate meeting with Dr. Emilien Rousseau. The doctor soon arrived. He was dressed as usual. A dark suit, a perfectly knotted tie, and a calm expression. But Poirot noticed a subtle stiffness in his shoulders, an unnecessary pause as he settled into the chair opposite him. "Doctor," Poirot began, carefully adjusting his binoculars, "I beg you not to misunderstand my next question. I ask it with the same courtesy with which one asks about blood pressure. Were you romantically involved with Madame Ariel?" Rousseau didn't respond immediately. His gaze slid toward the window, as if searching for an answer in the branches of the trees. "No." Then, after a brief silence, he added, "Not exactly." A modified no is sometimes the echo of a yes that doesn't yet dare, Poirot said gently. "Did he love her?" Rousseau narrowed his eyes, as if light had been shone directly into his face. "What I felt for Ariel wasn't youthful passion, if that's what you're implying. It was understanding, pity perhaps, but also affection. She was a trapped woman. You've seen what it means to be young and widowed in this house." Poirot nodded slowly. "And did she reciprocate that affection?" The doctor stood up. "He never said anything to me, and if he did, they were gestures I wanted to interpret." Poirot let the silence hang between them for a few seconds before continuing. "You said you were in the music room the night of the crime. What kind of documents were you reviewing?" "Prescription, pads, and a letter from the pharmacy in Lyon. Nothing relevant. Could you show me that letter?" Rousseau hesitated. "I threw it away. I didn't consider it important." Poirot gave a slight smile. "Funny. You're a meticulous man, orderly, and yet you throw away a document in the middle of a murder investigation. It had no relation to the case. Maybe not with the case, but maybe with you." The doctor stood up, looking somewhat offended. "Are you accusing me of something, Monsieur Poirot?" "I'm watching you, doctor, nothing more. And the human soul, when it feels observed, often reveals its truest reflection." As soon as Rousseau left, Poirot asked the maid to call Cousin Armand. He arrived minutes later, haggard, carrying a cane he used more for dramatic effect than necessity. He had the air of a man who had been drinking alone all night and wasn't sure if he regretted it. "Monsieur Poirot, any progress?" "I fear this. Strain is beginning to affect my already fragile nervous system." "I have no doubt about it, Monsieur Armand. I'd like to ask you something very specific. Could you describe for me, precisely, what the chess game you played with Madame Ariel on the night of the crime was like?" Armand's face tensed. "The game? Well, it was quick. We played just one. She dropped out early. I think she lost interest. She left me with the board half finished. What time was that?" "Around 9. Or a little earlier. I don't know for sure. I went to the greenhouse afterward. Poirot took out a small notepad. Good. You reconstruct for me the position of the pieces at the moment Madame Ariel left." Armand laughed. "Reconstruct it? Oh, come on. Who remembers that? A good player does remember. A bad player tries to evade the question." Armand crossed his arms uncomfortably. "It wasn't a formal game. I didn't take notes. I guess I was losing. She had more pieces. Is that important?" "It will be," replied Poirot, "if it turns out that the game never happened." Armand opened his mouth, but Poirot had already stood up. "Thank you, sir. You may leave." Poirot spent the rest of the afternoon sorting through small details. He observed the wilted flowers in a vase by the piano. He counted the steps from the music room to the library. With his cane, he measured the distance between the Baron's reading chair and the bay window. Each fragment of disorder was, to him, a verse in the hidden poem of the crime. When the clock struck 5, he called Margot. She arrived with the same air of iron control that characterized her. But Poirot perceived a tiny crack, the way she paused on the threshold, as if afraid of what he might say. "Mademoiselle," Poirot began, "I have a simple observation. You said that Madame Laurette brought you tea at 9:30, yet she claims she did so before 9. Margot narrowed her eyes. "You may be confused, or that you are, or that you're both telling the truth, from your own perspective." Poirot approached the desk. "But there's something else interesting. This letter from the Baron, half-written, seems to have been interrupted, curiously, at an unfinished sentence." Margot kept silence. Poirot continued, "If anything happens to me, don't look to the enemies. Look inside my house, because—" He read gravely. "Does that warning mean anything? To you? No, I had no idea it existed. And yet you were waiting for her?" said Poirot gently. Margot paled barely. It was a blink, nothing more, but Poirot saw it. "You know, mademoiselle, silence also leaves traces." That night, Poirot retired to his room with his notebook filled with contradictions, flimsy alibis, repressed emotions, silences more eloquent than words. He knew the crime hadn't been committed with violence, but with precision, with calculation. Someone had made the Baron look like a victim of his own doing, and Poirot already knew who. He just needed the culprit to take one more step. False one. Chapter 5. The Whisper in the Greenhouse. Night had fallen upon the Château de Vezancy with an artificial stillness, as if even the wind hesitated to disturb the secret slumbering beneath its roof. Poirot, however, was not asleep. He walked with measured steps along the east wing corridor, accompanied only by the faint creak of his polished shoes and the occasional glint of his cane on the tiles. Around midnight, he slipped out into the back garden unannounced and headed toward the greenhouse, an old-fashioned glass and wrought-iron structure that stood beside a row of carelessly pruned bushes. He hadn't asked for company, but Inspector Lemaire, instinctive and somewhat suspicious of the Belgian's methods, had silently followed him from the library. "Are you looking for something specific, Monsieur Poirot?" Lemaire finally murmured, crossing his arms as the detective opened the greenhouse door. "No, Inspector, I'm listening. I'm listening to what wasn't said in this house. And this place speaks." The interior of the greenhouse was warm, saturated with humidity and the scent of plants. Plants climbed metal shelves. Some, already wilted, looked like ghosts of the care they once received. On a side bench, a cigarette butt was still visible, partially crushed. Poirot bent down to look at her. He didn't touch her. Monsieur Armand claimed he came here the night of the crime to smoke, she said softly. "But he didn't say what he smoked." "What does that matter?" Lemaire asked. "A lot, when the aroma I perceive isn't ordinary tobacco, but a cigar scented with bergamot, a rarity, and not exactly Monsieur Armand's style." Lemaire approached. "So you think someone else was here?" Poirot pointed to a mark on the nearby flower pot, a slight groove in the soil, like a slipper turned on its axis. "I think someone overheard a conversation here. A conversation that wasn't meant to be overheard." The next morning, Poirot requested a private meeting with Ariel. He found her, in the music room, playing a soft piece on the piano. She stopped her fingers as soon as she saw him. "Madam," Poirot said bluntly, "I need to know precisely what you discussed with Monsieur Armand during that alleged chess game." Ariel hesitated, her hands folded in her lap. "Not much. He talked more than I did. Trivial comments, childhood memories. I was absent." "Did he mention the Baron?" "Yes. He called it the old relic. He said Etienne had more secrets than portraits. I didn't answer." Poirot leaned slightly towards her. "And you told him about the will?" Ariel's eyes widened in genuine surprise. "The will?" "Oui, madame. The Baron changed his will a week before he died. He removed a clause guaranteeing his monthly income to Monsieur Armand. Ariel paled. I didn't know. Then maybe Armand knew before you. She narrowed her eyes. Are you insinuating that Armand? I'm not implying, I'm proposing. And in this proposal, there's a possibility that Armand knew the Baron was planning to cut off his source of income, and that he confronted him that night, perhaps even in the presence of a third party, perhaps here in the greenhouse. Later, Poirot approached Margot. He found her in the study, rereading a book without turning a page. Unlike previous days, her expression was more tense, almost tired. Mademoiselle, Poirot began, do you recall seeing or hearing anything unusual on the night of the crime? Not inside the chateau, but outside, in the garden. Any noises? Any voices? Margot denied it at first, but then seemed to hesitate. I heard something. Voices, near the greenhouse. 2 men. I looked out the window, but I didn't see anything. The light wasn't on. I assumed it was Armand with one of the waiters. Poirot pursed his lips. Didn't you recognize the voices? One of them was Armand. The other, I don't know. Maybe Dr. Rousseau. They spoke quietly, but one of them raised his voice. He said something like, You wouldn't dare. Then there was silence. Poirot acknowledged with a slight nod. And he didn't mention it before? I thought it didn't matter. Now I'm not so sure. Poirot walked slowly down the first-floor portrait corridor. The De La Fontaine figures stared back at him, stern and silent. In his mind, the pieces were beginning to fall into place. A secretly changed will. A cousin who had fallen on hard times. A widow caught between duty and fear. A daughter with a broken past. And at the centre of it all, a man who had died not by his own hand, but by a subtle pressure exerted from the shadows. The assassin, Poirot thought, hadn't wielded the gun. He'd merely pushed the Baron to the edge. He'd whispered a possibility, a threat, or perhaps a truth he couldn't bear, and then he'd left him there, alone with his demons. But there was still one piece missing. One word, a gesture, a look that fell where it shouldn't. Poirot knew he would soon have her. And when that moment arrived, the entire castle, with its tapestries, its portraits and its silences, would hear the whole truth. Chapter 6. The last page of the diary. The morning dawned slowly over Vezancy, but in Poirot's mind the wheels turned with Swiss precision. While the others ate breakfast under forced air in the main dining room, Poirot walked briskly to the north wing of the chateau, where Baron Etienne's private library was located, a separate space from the central library where the body had been found. This one was more intimate, more cluttered, and much less familiar to the rest of the household. It was Madame Laurette who pointed out its existence to him, with a mixture of fear and discretion. Hardly anyone uses it, Monsieur Poirot. The Baron kept it locked, except when he needed space to think, as he put it. Poirot forced the lock with the help of Inspector Lemaire, who followed him like a restless shadow, and entered without hesitation. The air in the small room was stale, as if it had held dense thoughts for too long. The walls were lined with shelves of underlined books and loose papers. On the desk, covered with a sheet of opaque glass, rested an inkless quill, several unsealed envelopes, and right in the centre, a black-covered, untitled notebook. Poirot didn't open it immediately. He first held it in his hands, as if he could absorb its contents through his fingers. Then, with a precise gesture, he placed it on the desk and scanned the first few pages. They were Baron Etienne's personal notes, vague reflections, financial worries, thoughts about Margot, constant mentions of his late wife, Claire. But it was when he reached the last written page that Poirot stopped dead in his tracks. The handwriting was firm, unwavering. The ink was fresh, barely dry, and what was said there was a fragment of raw humanity. I've heard the whisper. There is no safe place in this house. My blood watches me. If I don't act, I will be devoured from within. And I still don't know if I fear punishment more. Or her judgment. Poirot read the sentence 3 times. Then he whispered it, as if he needed to hear it himself. My blood watches over me. It's not a vague metaphor. It's a direct signal. Le Maire, who had been reading over his shoulder, frowned. Are you referring to Margot? Perhaps. But it could also be Armand, a side relative, or... Poirot stopped. Someone he considered family, but not by blood. Like Dr. Rousseau? Poirot stared at him. Exactly, mon ami. Someone whose closeness isn't explained by blood ties, but by affection, or a shared secret. Returning to the dining room, Poirot found the suspects gathered, unaware that he was already holding a weapon more powerful than a revolver. The truth, still covered by a veil. Margot stood by the window, her arms crossed, looking out at the gardens. Ariel leafed through a book without reading it. Armand spoke quietly to Rousseau, his nervousness palpable. Poirot cleared his throat, and everyone turned to him. My friends, he said with a courteous smile, I'd like to ask for a few more minutes of your patience. I'm getting closer to understanding what really happened in this house. But I need one last piece. A missing page. He turned his gaze directly to Margot. Mademoiselle, could you tell me if the Baron kept any kind of private diary or record that you were aware of? She frowned. Not that I know of, although he used to disappear to the north wing for hours. He always said he needed me time. And you never followed him. I wasn't allowed to go in there. Poirot nodded. Then he turned to Armand. Monsieur, when you mentioned that the Baron had secrets, did you mean something specific? Armand shrugged. Rumours, murmurs. My cousin wasn't a saint, but he wasn't a murderer either. Poirot let the comment hang in the air without responding. Then he turned to Ariel. Madame, did you know that your late husband had changed his will? She opened her eyes in surprise. No. Did he change it? Yes. He eliminated the lifetime pension for your cousin Armand, but he left the provisions for you intact. And someone else. Everyone looked at him expectantly. Poirot paused briefly. For Dr. Rousseau. A murmur ran through the room. Rousseau blinked but didn't deny it. Etienne had mentioned it to me. He said it as a gesture of gratitude for my years of service. It wasn't a large sum. But enough to make others uncomfortable, said Poirot, without raising his voice. Hours later, Poirot was walking with Le Maire under the stone arches by the garden. The inspector seemed more agitated than usual. Are you going to gather them together soon? All of them? Poirot nodded calmly. Soon, yes, but there's still a spark missing. The murderer, or rather, whoever caused the Baron's death, left no physical traces. Only overwhelming emotion, an ill-contained guilt, and I know how to make it crumble. As Poirot looked towards the horizon, how everything hidden in an old house collapses, with a simple misaligned reflection. He stopped, his eyes, sharp as scalpels, fixed on a point in the castle. "Tomorrow, Inspector. Tomorrow night I'll gather everyone together, and then the little grey cells will have completed their work." Chapter 7. The Clock That Didn't Strike 10. Evening fell like a velvet curtain over the Château de Vezancy. The fading light tinged the stained glass windows with copper and lengthened the shadows in the cold corridors. Poirot, more silent than usual, paced the main hall with his hands clasped behind his back. Every corner of the place now seemed to contain more than it let on. The carpets, the curtains, even the clocks hanging on the walls seemed like unwitting accomplices in a carefully disguised crime. One of these clocks, a pendulum model set in a walnut glass case at the end of the east wing corridor, caught his attention with a slight uneven tick. Poirot stopped in front of it and frowned. "Funny?" he whispered. He took out his pocket watch, a Swiss piece as shiny as a polished mirror, and compared the time. 10:14. And yet this poor gentleman insists on marking 9:55. It was then that Madame Laurette appeared, carrying a lit candelabra. "That clock hasn't worked for weeks, sir. No one fixes it any more." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "For weeks? Are you sure?" "Yes, sir. I believe since before the Baron's birthday." Poirot muttered to himself, "So, why was he mentioned in Ariel's statement?" After a short while, Poirot requested another private conversation with the widow. Ariel arrived nervously, with a shawl over her shoulders and her fingers interlaced, as if protecting herself from something unseen. "Madame," said Poirot with measured kindness, "you stated that when you came downstairs on the night of the crime, you saw the hall clock strike just before 10. "Yes, that's what I saw. But the clock hasn't worked for weeks." A sharp silence fell over the air. Ariel looked away. Her lips trembled slightly. "Maybe I was wrong. I was nervous, confused." "No, madam, you weren't mistaken. You mentioned that time with certainty. You even repeated it when you changed your story. You wanted others to think that could not have been there at the time of the shooting that his testimony was verifiable. I didn't think of it that way. Yes, he thought it over carefully. Too carefully." That same evening, Poirot reviewed the notes in his personal notebook. He drew a small diagram with dates and lines connecting those involved, like an orderly spiderweb. Then he added a word: pressure. No violence, no poison, emotional pressure, a subtle art, more deadly than a weapon. At 9 o'clock, he went to Margot's room. The young woman received him with distrust. "Any more questions, sir?" "Just one, mademoiselle," he replied, bluntly. "Why did you have a key to the Baron's private library?" She blinked. "What does it say?" "Madame Laurette saw her leave there one night, 3 days before the crime. You had a copy of the key." Margot didn't respond. Her silence was a louder response than any words. "Did you know about the diary?" "Not until I got inside. I wanted to find something, anything that would explain why my father had started to hate me." "And you found it?" just empty pages and disjointed sentences. I was losing my mind. Poirot watched her closely. No, mademoiselle, I wasn't crazy. I was scared, but not for you. Margot looked down. So, whose? Poirot did not reply. At 11 o'clock, Poirot went to the main hall, where Inspector Lemaire was waiting for him impatiently. Have you figured it all out? Poirot nodded slowly. Oui. I've got almost everything. The crime was as psychological as it was silent. The Baron didn't die from a bullet. He died from a whisper, from a look, from the suggestion of something worse than death. Someone placed the idea with surgical precision. And who was it? I'll reveal it tomorrow. In front of everyone. Why wait? Poirot approached the window and looked out at the gardens where shadows danced among the hedges. Because this truth, Inspector, isn't just a revelation. It's a wound. And wounds, to heal, need to be opened in the light. With everyone present, Hercule Lemaire crossed his arms. And the watch? Ah, the poor clock. Poirot said with a melancholy smile. It was the most visible lie of all. And yet no one saw it. That night, while the occupants of the chateau slept uneasily, Poirot sat alone in the tapestry room. He placed 3 objects on the table: an unfinished letter, a perfumed cigar butt, and a crooked drawing found in the private library. Everything was ready. Tomorrow the little grey cells would speak, and they would do it without mercy. Chapter 8. The Meeting of All the Mirrors. The great hall of the Château de Vezancy seemed different that morning. Perhaps it was the arrangement of the chairs, forming a semicircle in front of the fireplace. Or perhaps it was the expectant silence that permeated every stone on the floor. Hunting tapestries hung like silent witnesses, while the columns reflected the faint glimmer of the winter sun. Hercule Poirot, impeccable in his light grey suit and with his perfectly symmetrical moustache, occupied the centre chair. To his right, Inspector Lemaire waited with his arms crossed. Opposite them, in an almost theatrical formation, were Margot, Ariel, Armand, and Dr. Rousseau. No one spoke. Poirot broke the silence in his usual tone, gentle, polite, yet impossible to ignore. My lords and ladies, I thank you for your presence. I've called you here to share what I've discovered. Not a judgment, but a reconstruction. A mirror, if you will, in which we must all look. A pause, no murmur. Baron Etienne de la Fontaine wasn't murdered violently. There was no poison, no struggle, no intrusion. But he didn't commit suicide, out of sheer will either. What happened was something more subtle, more cruel, a murder by emotional induction. A slight shudder ran through the room. Let me start with the most obvious, the library scene. A glass of brandy, a dropped revolver, a closed door. Everything points to suicide. But the scene was ordered intentionally, not for the Baron, but for the one who wanted us to see him as a broken man. Poirot took an object from the nearby table, a small fountain pen. This quill pen was found alongside an unfinished letter in the Baron's private library. In it, Etienne writes that he has been pressured, under surveillance, and that he fears not his enemies, but someone within his own house. That someone didn't need to fire the weapon. They only needed to make him believe that his ruin, social, moral, or familial, was inevitable. He turned to Ariel. "Madame, you lied, not once, but twice. You said you were in your room. Then you said you came downstairs and saw someone leaving. But then you mentioned the clock not working. A fatal error. You planted a fake time to appear innocent, but only managed to indicate that there was premeditation." Ariel looked down. She didn't speak. And why would an innocent widow lie? Because she's not completely innocent. You knew about the relationship between the Baron and Margot. You knew there was tension, and you knew Armand desperately wanted his lifetime pension. In the midst of them all, you feared being accused, not guilty. That made her a complicit spectator of the silence, but not the perpetrator. Poirot turned to Armand. "Monsieur, you claimed to have been in the greenhouse the night of the crime. There I found a perfumed cigar butt. Not a common one, but a type that only Dr. Rousseau smokes. That's how I knew that you were not alone, and that he lied about his chess game with Madame Ariel." Armand tensed. "I just sat with her for a while. I thought it was no big deal. Ah, sir, every lie has weight. You were in the wrong place at the wrong time, but you weren't in control. You were just following along." Poirot finally turned to Rousseau. "Doctor, you were more astute. You feigned neutrality. You remained calm. But you had assess, knowledge and emotional influence about the Baron. You knew Etienne was on edge. You knew how to talk to him, how to instill fear. And why? Because Etienne was going to change the will one more time. This time for eliminate you." The doctor paled visibly. "That's not true," he said, though his voice was no longer strong. Poirot held up a small yellowish sheet of paper. "Here I have the draft of that change." The Baron himself wrote it in his diary. He was supposed to meet with his lawyer the next day, but he never showed up, because that same night someone convinced him that all was lost. An icy silence fell over the room. Poirot continued in a firm voice. "Dr. Rousseau, you didn't fire the shot, but you spoke. You used your position, your proximity, your knowledge of the Baron's deepest fears to drive him to suicide. And that, monsieur, is an equally real crime. You can't prove it," Rousseau whispered. "No one can prove a conversation." Poirot looked at him with compassion. "No, but all we can recognize when a silence weighs more than a gunshot. You left too many traces, witnesses to your absences, cigarette butts, and most revealing, the gaze of someone who has seen a man fall without stopping him." Rousseau sank into his seat. He said nothing more. When Lemaire stood up to arrest the doctor, Ariel covered her face with both hands. Margot slowly closed her eyes. Armand simply stared at the ground, expressionless. Poirot stood up and smoothed his waistcoat. The perfect crime isn't one that leaves no trace, but one that tries to hide behind the appearance of inevitability. But nothing is inevitable, mes amis. Only the consequences are. And with that phrase, he turned around and left the room. The echo of his footsteps, like his deduction, was orderly, constant, and unappealable. Chapter 9. Justice Beneath the Surface. The next morning brought a strange stillness to the Château de Vezancy. It was no longer the dense silence of mystery, but a thinner, weary one, as if the great house had exhaled after weeks of holding its breath. In the kitchen, the dishes clanged less harshly. In the hallways, the footsteps were more human, and in the tapestry room, where the masks had fallen the night before, there was no longer tension, only consequences. Poirot ate breakfast with his usual meticulousness. Toast with perfectly portioned butter, an egg boiled for exactly 5 minutes, and a cup of black coffee that he stared at as if he could read his fate in its reflection. Opposite him, Inspector Lemaire flicked through his notebook with a mixture of satisfaction and resignation. "I never thought something like this could be sustained by words alone," he said finally. "Dr. Rousseau didn't shoot, he didn't poison, but in the end the Baron is dead because of him." "Exactly, mon ami," Poirot replied calmly. "What he did was induce, not execute. Do you remember chess? Sometimes you don't checkmate. You just push the king into a corner where he surrenders." Lemaire closed the notebook. "Do you think you'll get a conviction?" Poirot made a slight gesture with his hand. "That's no longer in my hands. But the tribunal of conscience is more constant than any jury. And Rousseau, believe me, has lived with that shadow hanging over him for a long time. Now he's simply enlightened." In the east wing of the chateau, Ariel discreetly packed her bags. No one had asked her to. No one had expelled her. But she understood that her time there was over. There was no hatred in her eyes, but a weariness born of accumulated shame. Poirot appeared in her room unannounced. She wasn't surprised to see him. "Come to judge me, Monsieur Poirot." "No, madam, you've already done it yourself." She sighed, sitting on the edge of the bed. "I could have told the truth from the beginning. I could have told what I saw, what I sensed, but I was afraid. Fear, madame, is the rope with which many bind their own will. And now, what's left for me? The freedom to start without lies. Believe me, it's no small feat." In the garden, Margot strolled with a mechanical gait. Poirot approached her along the gravel path. She listened to him without turning around. "And me, Monsieur Poirot, am I also among the guilty? You didn't cause your father's death, nor did you push him, but you lived with wounds that never healed. And sometimes, mademoiselle, resentment doesn't kill, but it fuels the silence that others use as a weapon. I thought I hated him," she confessed. "But now I don't know if I hated him, or if I just wanted him to apologize." Poirot didn't reply immediately. Then he said softly, "The apologies that never come are usually the ones that weigh the most. But living in the hope that a dead person will grant them is choosing to carry their voice inside you. Don't do it. Don't allow it." Margot nodded. She said nothing more. That afternoon, as Inspector Lemaire prepared to take Rousseau into official custody in Lyon, Poirot requested one last tour of the chateau. He walked alone through the library, his fingers touching the spines of the books still arranged as the Baron had left them. He stopped in front of the armchair where Etienne had been found. "You feared the judgment of the living more than that of the dead," he murmured. "But not all judgments condemn. Some merely reveal." He looked around one last time. The carpet was still slightly crooked, but it didn't bother him any more. As he left, Poirot bowed farewell, without any theatricality. Ariel watched him from the staircase. Margot watched him from one of the high windows. Armand had disappeared the night before, claiming an urgent visit to Dijon. But in reality, no one was looking for him anymore. Getting into the car, Lemaire lit a cigarette. And now, another case, another death. Poirot smiled. Maybe, but not today. Today, my little grey cells need a rest. And my soul, a little music. Yes, something that doesn't lie. Maybe Mozart. And as the car drove away from the castle, the sun, for the first time in days, dared to break through the clouds completely. Chapter 10. The Farewell Comment. 3 days later, the fog that usually hung over the Vézency Valley completely dissipated, as if the chateau had exhaled its last reserve of secrets. The newspaper reports were discreet but clear. Renowned provincial doctor arrested after revelations in self-induced suicide case. The word murder was not used, but it was implicit between the lines, as it had been in the actions that led to Baron Etienne's death. Poirot, for his part, was staying in a modest guest-house in Beaune, a village not far from the chateau. From his window, he gazed at the terraced vineyards, holding a cup of hot chocolate. The silence surrounding him was unlike that of the chateau. This one was clean, comforting, with no suspicions hanging on the walls. It was there that he received the letter. It came with no return address, in a plain white envelope with elegant feminine handwriting. She opened it delicately, as if unfolding a fragile truth. The contents were brief. "Mr. Poirot, I can't thank you enough. You not only solved a crime, but you also forced me to look at myself without disguises. I've left the chateau. I don't know where I'll go yet, but for the first time I'm not afraid to walk alone." With respect, Ariel Poirot reread it twice, then placed it under his napkin ring, without adding anything else. There was no satisfaction or pride on his face, only a slight nod. It wasn't a victory, but it was a human justice. That same afternoon, he received a visit from Inspector Lemaire, no longer in uniform, dressed in street clothes and with dark circles under his eyes from administrative fatigue. "I've come to say goodbye, Monsieur Poirot, and to give you something," he said, taking out a small pocket watch wrapped in a handkerchief. Poirot took it with curiosity. "From the Baron?" "Yes." According to the family lawyer, it was one of the personal items he had intended to give away in the event of his death. He mentioned it in an informal note. It said, "To the one who is able to read time in the silences rather than in the chimes." Poirot smiled gently. That watch, slim, gilded, of Genevan origin, kept time with elegant precision, but it was more symbolic than useful. A curious gift, don't you think, Inspector? I'd say deserved. Poirot kept it undramatic. "Thank you, sir." But it wasn't time that resolved this case. It was the contradiction. Contradiction? Oui, when a woman swears twice differently, it's not out of malice. It's because she's afraid. And when a man hears voices in the greenhouse that he shouldn't hear, it's because something, it was said to be heard. Nothing in this house happened by accident. Not even the silence. Lemaire nodded. Then he asked in a more personal tone, "Don't you get tired, Monsieur Poirot, of seeing the worst in people?" Poirot thought for a moment. Then he said, looking towards the window, "I get tired, yes, but I also see the other things. The crack where the light comes in, the letter that arrives, unexpectedly. The small gesture. The truth that peeks out, even when no one calls for it. It's in those moments that I know my little grey cells still have a purpose. The next day, Poirot left for Paris by train without fanfare. He carried a small suitcase, the Baron's watch, and a new blank notebook. In his compartment, he took out his fountain pen and wrote the first line. Case, the woman who swore differently twice. Conclusion, not all crimes are committed with the hands. Some are committed out of fear. Resolution, the truth, like time, always finds a way to reveal itself. You just have to know how to listen. He put away the notebook, leaned back slightly, and closed his eyes. And for the first time in weeks, Hercule Poirot slept without a single doubt. Chapter 11. Poirot's Final Reflection. 2 weeks after leaving Vezancy, Hercule Poirot walked along the Quai Voltaire in Paris, under a grey sky that seemed reluctant to decide whether it would rain or not. Paris was a city that breathed intrigue as naturally as it exhaled art. And yet, that day, the great detective wasn't thinking about any new cases. His mind, usually occupied by puzzles and human contradictions, returned again and again to the Château de Vezancy. He stopped in front of a second-hand bookstore. In the window, among faded volumes, was an edition of The Flowers of Evil. A line on the cover, underlined in red, caught his attention. There are scents as fresh as children's flesh. Exactly, Poirot murmured. Some crimes have a scent, others an absence of scent that is also slanderous. He went into the bookstore and bought the book, not because he needed it, but because, as in all cases that had a profound impact on him, he felt the need to preserve a symbol, a capsule of the emotional echo that continued to resonate after the official closure of the case. That afternoon, he met with Georges Boutet, an old acquaintance, a retired journalist and crime writer who now published in literary magazines. Georges was one of the few who knew when to speak, and when to let Poirot speak. They met at a corner table at the Café de Flore. Poirot ordered his hot chocolate. Georges ordered a double espresso. "You've been staying away from the noise, Hercule. A difficult case." Poirot nodded without hurrying. Difficult not because of its logical complexity, but because of its human texture. A crime without a crime, Georges. A murder executed without violence, with just a well-placed word. A crime of thought. Georges frowned. Suggestion? Emotional manipulation? Yes, an induction, almost surgical. The perpetrator didn't wield a weapon or use poison. He just watched and spoke. He used just the right words to push Baron Etienne de la Fontaine toward the abyss of suicide. Georges took out a small notebook, but Poirot raised a hand. "No, don't write. This isn't for publication. So why tell me?" Poirot looked out the window. The winter trees looked like pencil-drawn paper figures, because I'm still deducing, not the crime, but its effect. This case wasn't solved by identifying the culprit. It was solved when I realized everyone was a victim, in one way or another. Everyone played a role, but not everyone knew they were involved. Georges drank from his cup. "And that bothers you?" "No, my friend, it reveals something to me. that the human soul can be as lethal as a dagger, as fragile as glass, and as opaque as an uncleaned mirror. And what will you do now? Poirot smiled. Rest. Although I suspect another crime is already brewing, in some villa, in some train car, or perhaps in the silence of a bourgeois dinner party. Georges leaned towards him. And if there isn't one? Poirot raised an eyebrow in amusement. Then you'll see me writing memoirs, although who would believe that a murder could happen without guilty hands? That evening, upon returning to his apartment on the Rue des Martyrs, Poirot sat at his desk and took out his personal notebook. He flipped through the pages until he reached the case of the woman who swore twice differently. At the bottom of the summary, he wrote one more line. The greatest crime is that which forces another to bear the blame for one's own despair. And then, carefully closing the notebook, he stood for a long moment gazing into the flame of the desk lamp. The world was full of crimes, yes, but also of unexpected redemptions. Poirot knew it, and that night he allowed himself to think that maybe, for once, the truth had come in time to prevent the next tragedy. Chapter 12. The Whisper That Returned. A week after his return to Paris, Hercule Poirot received a telegram that stopped him in his tracks as he organized his desk. It came from Beaune, signed with only the initials, A.D. The message was brief, so terse as to be alarming. Something's happened. Please come here. It's not what it seems. A.D. Poirot did not hesitate. The initials could only belong to Ariel de la Fontaine. Arriving in Beaune that same afternoon, Poirot didn't go to the centre or to the boarding house where he had last stayed. Instead, he followed the address on the back of the telegram. Ohrid, small country house surrounded by wintry vineyards and a rusty gate. Ariel was waiting for him there, visibly upset but more composed than he had imagined. "Thank you for coming, Monsieur Poirot," she said as soon as he opened the door. "I didn't know who else to turn to." Poirot delicately removed his gloves and nodded. When a troubled soul writes, "It's not what it seems," you turn to them, especially if you're already familiar with the tendency of certain dramas to disguise themselves as calm. Ariel led him into the living room. A lit fireplace filled the room with a gentle warmth, but it didn't quite lift the tension in the air. An open letter lay on the table. Next to it, a small package wrapped in brown paper. "I received this yesterday," she said, sitting down opposite Poirot. "There's no return address, but its contents, it's kept me awake at night." Poirot took the letter carefully. The handwriting was elegant, firm, masculine. "Ariel, don't think. It's all over. The Baron left more than one secret, and you don't know half of what he kept quiet. He wrote things he didn't hand over, pages he kept, letters he didn't burn. Soon someone will come looking for you. When that happens, remember, you have something to lose too. A friend from the past." Poirot looked up. Ariel was watching him with genuine fear. "Have you opened the package?" She shook her head. "I didn't dare." Poirot untied it with meticulous slowness. Inside was an old leather notebook with a barely legible label, Etienne, Private. Upon opening it, she found notes written in faded ink. It wasn't a formal diary. Rather, It seemed like a collection of intimate thoughts, seemingly unrelated phrases, quotes, and unsent letters. One in particular was dated just 3 days before the Baron's death. "Dear Claire, if you could see me now, you would know what I've allowed. I fell in love again, yes, but I've also betrayed my promise. I hid something from Margot, not out of cruelty, but out of fear. The fear of losing her. She doesn't know that." The sentence ended abruptly. Poirot frowned. In the margin, in a different ink, was a sentence written in a more recent hand. What if he knew all along? "You recognize that handwriting?" asked Poirot. Ariel watched her closely. "It's not the Baron's, nor mine, but it looks familiar." Poirot slowly closed the notebook. "Madam, someone is trying to reopen a still festering wound, not for the sake of justice, but with the intention of manipulation. Perhaps something else still lies hidden, not in the rooms of the chateau, but in the memories of those who lived there. Do you think this has to do with Margot?" Poirot stood up and walked slowly towards the window. "It could be her, or someone who has convinced her of something. Remember that truth, when mixed with resentment, becomes poison. What if Margot now knew what the Baron was afraid to tell her? What if someone were to give it to her with a convenient twist?" Ariel sat up. "Are you saying that this isn't the end?" "Madame," said Poirot, turning to look at her, "endings are rarely true, especially when the crime ends not with punishment, but with the transformation of innocence into tools." That night, Poirot asked to stay at Ariel's house, not out of courtesy, but out of prudence. He reread each page of the notebook, noted parallels, and when he reached the penultimate entry, he found a passage that unsettled him. If she knew that her mother didn't die from illness, but from the decision I made in my silence, she would hate me. But I did it to protect her from an impossible truth. Poirot slowly closed the notebook. The Baron's past still held secrets, and someone from the shadows was planning to use them. Chapter 13. The Testament in the Shadow. The next morning, the fog hung over the fields of bone again, like a veil that refused to lift. In the living room of the small country house, Poirot leafed through the notebook he had found in the package for the 4th time. He wasn't looking for new words. He was looking for rhythm, pauses, omissions, the words that the Baronneau wrote. Ariel, sitting a few steps away, watched him silently. "Do you think the Baron was talking about Margot?" he finally asked. "That she's not his daughter?" Poirot looked up. "Not necessarily. But there's something Etienne didn't want to put in writing, and something he was afraid she'd discover. And if that's related to the death of Claire, his first wife, then we've been investigating a crime that's actually a consequence of it." "A consequence, yes, madam. A death that occurred 20 years after the real sin." Later, Poirot and Ariel visited the de la Fontaine family's notary office in Beaune. The notary, Monsieur Lavis, was an elderly man with a drooping moustache and cautious eyes. He received them in a dark wood-panelled office that smelled of dust and old ink. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, inclining his head, "I remind you of the proceedings following the Baron's death. How may I help you today?" Poirot settled into the chair in front of the desk. I'd like to know if Baron Etienne de la Fontaine left behind any documents that weren't included in the official reading of the will, letters, codicils, even private notes. Levis stirred. There was one. Ariel bowed slightly. A document that wasn't in the formal will, but was found among his papers. I classified it as personal and sealed it out of respect. It was a letter addressed to Margot. It was never sent. Poirot calmly extended his hand. I'm afraid, monsieur, that it must be read now. Mademoiselle Margot's life could be in danger. Someone is manipulating the pieces of the past, and this letter may prevent a new crime from being built on an old truth. Levis hesitated, but at the seriousness in Poirot's voice, he stood up and went to a filing cabinet. From there he took out a sealed envelope, unaddressed, with only a single handwritten word at the top, Margot. He handed it to Poirot. I haven't read it, but I saw the last sentence when I closed it. And what did he say? The notary swallowed. You deserve to hear it from my voice, not from the silence of a grave. Poirot read the letter in a low voice, while Ariel waited tensely. It was a brief confession, written in a shaky but determined hand. In it, Etienne revealed that Claire, his first wife, had suffered from severe emotional imbalances, and that he, out of pride and fear of scandal, refused to institutionalize her when it became dangerous to do so. One night, Claire, in a fit of delirium, took Margot as a child and locked her in the cellar for hours. The Baron did nothing. 2 days later, Claire died after falling from her bedroom balcony. The official version was fainting, but the Baron knew that it was not an accident. And from then on, she lived in fear that Margot would remember. Or worse, that someone would reveal it to her with the intention of destroying her. I didn't dare tell you that I was also guilty, wrote Etienne, because I feared myself more as a father than as a man. Poirot gently lowered the letter. Now I understand why the Baron felt watched. Not by an external threat, but by his past. And someone who had access to these documents, found this letter before we did. Ariel whispered, Margot, do you know? Not yet, but he'll know. The question is, who wants me to know? And when plans to use that truth as a weapon. That evening, back at the cottage, Poirot reflected in his notebook. There were too many pieces floating around. A package with no return address, a threatening note, a private letter retrieved too late, and the feeling that the castle's circle had not yet fully closed. As he was about to put away the notebook, the bell at the entrance rang with a dry chime. Ariel, nervous, went to open it. Poirot remained standing, attentive. A postman handed them one more envelope. No sender. Inside, a single handwritten sheet of paper. It is no longer enough to know the truth. Now someone will have to pay for hiding it. Poirot looked up. Tomorrow we will return to Vaisoncy, madam. The shadow has not finished its journey. Chapter 14. Return to the House of Judgment. The sky above Vaisoncy was the same leaden grey that had covered it on the day of the crime. Nothing seemed to have changed in the castle. The hedges still untrimmed, the dusty stained-glass windows, the imperturbable silence hanging like a heavy cloth between its walls. And yet, for Hercule Poirot, everything had changed. because this time he wasn't returning to solve a murder, but to prevent a new one. Ariel accompanied him silently. Her face reflected a mixture of anxiety and resignation. The carriage they had rented stopped at the main gate. A new, unfamiliar servant came out to greet them. The staff had changed, the atmosphere hadn't. "Is Margot still here?" asked Poirot. "Yes, sir. You haven't been out for days." Poirot nodded. He found it significant Margot welcomed them in the tapestry room. Her slim, tense figure contrasted with the stony gravity of the family portraits that seemed to have been looking back centuries. She was dressed in black, not as if in mourning, but as if in ceremony. Her eyes showed no surprise, only a cold, restrained gleam. "Have you come to bring me the truth?" he said without preamble. "I already have it, thank you." Poirot approached calmly. "Who gave it to you? It doesn't matter." "Yes, mademoiselle, it matters a lot." She held his gaze. "This anonymous envelope, my father's letter, and something else, a page that wasn't in the package you found. A confession written in my mother's own hand, in a note hidden inside one of her prayer books. Did you know she had written something before she died?" Poirot frowned. "I didn't know." Margot took the note out of her pocket. Poirot read it carefully. It was a short, bitter note. "If something happens to me, don't blame the wind. Blame the one who made me invisible. Etienne hasn't seen me for years. He erased me, and I've started to erase him." "My mother hated him," Margot said, "and he knew it. That's why he kept quiet. That's why he hid everything from me. Because if I knew, her memory would die with him." "And what will you do now that you know everything?" Margot looked down. Then she looked up more intensely. "I don't know. But someone in this house still hasn't paid. Someone who allowed everything, watched everything, and benefited from the fear of others. Someone like Ariel." Ariel paled. "They?" "Yes, you knew. You knew for years that my father kept secrets. You saw his torment, and you chose to remain silent to keep your place, your home, your family name, your security." Poirot intervened firmly, his voice low but tense. "Margot, the truth should not be used as a weapon. You are not seeking justice. You are seeking emotional revenge. And that, mademoiselle, destroys even the righteous. And what do you want me to do, Poirot? Hug her? Forgive her? No. I don't want you to become a mirror of the very man you now judge Etienne concealed out of fear. You intend to reveal out of punishment. Neither of you honored the truth, but you can still do it." Margot remained motionless. She wasn't crying. She wasn't breaking. She was carefully carved ice. That evening, Poirot requested a final audience with her in the library. Margot agreed, placed 2 objects in front of her, the complete letter from the Baron, and the watch that was bequeathed to him after the case. His father wrote these words: "Don't fear me. My worst crime wasn't what I did, but what I couldn't face with you." Margot read the sentence silently. And what does this mean? It means that, in his clumsy and cowardly way, he wanted something else. Redemption. He didn't get it. But you can break that chain. Break it how? Not by repeating it. Not by using pain as currency to inherit more pain. You have survived the weight of 2 broken parents. Don't become the architect of someone else's ruin. Margot squeezed the paper between her fingers. I'm tired, Monsieur Poirot. I know. That's why it's time to let go. At dawn, Margot left the castle. She carried only a suitcase, her father's letter, and the watch Poirot had given her. No one stopped her. No one said goodbye. But Ariel watched her from the window without saying a word. Poirot, at his side, murmured, She hasn't forgiven, but she has stopped the wheel. That's more than many achieve. Ariel, in a barely audible voice, asked, And now the house is empty, and the walls have stopped showing signs of it, and you, Poirot adjusted the cuffs of his coat. Moi, madame, I'll return to Paris. I have a flower that needs watering, a chair that misses my weight, and a notebook that hasn't been completed yet. As the train headed north, Poirot didn't look back. The case of the woman who swore differently twice was over, but the truth, like a seed buried deep within, was just beginning to grow. Chapter 15. The Flower That Was Born from Silence. Weeks after Poirot's return to Paris, spring showed its first signs in the Luxembourg Gardens. The first buds timidly emerged, and pigeons walked among the benches as if patrolling other people's emotions. It was there that Poirot chose to sit each morning, free from the weight of Vezance's shadow, but not from her reflection. The morning was cool. He carried a small, hard-bound notebook, different from the one he used during his investigations. This one had a different purpose. Not to record clues, but thoughts. That day he wrote, When the truth is hidden out of fear, it flourishes like a crooked root, stronger, more painful, harder to uproot. He put the notebook away and closed his eyes for a moment. What troubled him most, even now, was not the crime, nor even the emotional manipulation orchestrated by Rousseau. It was the echo. What remained vibrating in the air long after the crime was solved. Upon returning to his apartment, he found an unstamped envelope on his desk. His usual butler, Georges, had left it with a note. A young man dropped it off this morning. He didn't give his name. He seemed nervous. He asked me to hand-deliver it to him. Poirot raised an eyebrow. The envelope contained a short letter, written in blue ink. Mr. Poirot, I know you've already closed the case, but there's still something that doesn't add up. I've been reading the Baron's books, those in his private library, and I found between their pages a series of numbers written in pencil, along with a single word, Claire. Could it mean something? Don't want to relive the past. I just want to make sure it's truly buried. Poirot stood still. He needed no more to know that it was Margot. That same afternoon, he reviewed his case notes and the transcripts of the documents found in Vezancy. He couldn't recall any figures mentioned by the Baron. However, Claire, yes, she had been a figure full of ambiguity. Absent mother, emotional shadow, possible victim, or possible executioner. Poirot left immediately. He headed to the National Library, where he had requested a digital copy of the Baron's bibliographical archives. Among them was a collection of religious books, especially missals and psalters. There he found what he was looking for, an 1891 edition of the Book of Hours of the Virgin the scanned back cover, a pencil notation in tight handwriting, Epstein, 11.5, 4.7, Claire. Poirot leaned back in his chair. This isn't code. It's an emotional coordinate. Hours later, back in his apartment, Poirot read the figures again. And suddenly, something clicked. It wasn't an account number, nor a date. It was a biblical quote, 3 numbers, 3 verses, and 1 name. He ran to his edition of the Book of Proverbs, one of the Baron's favourites, according to his diaries. There he was, Proverbs 3:14. For her profit is better than the profit of silver, and her gain than fine gold. Proverbs 11:5, righteousness directs the path of the upright, but the wicked will fall in his wickedness. Proverbs 4:7, wisdom is the principal thing. Get wisdom, and over all your possessions get understanding. Poirot read the lines over and over again, and then he understood these were not mere religious reflections. They were a coded confession, a way in which the Baron spoke through the Bible of his own guilt. The silver and gold weren't riches, but symbols of what he'd traded for silence, his reputation, his comfort, the justice he failed to exercise with Claire, and his final plea for wisdom, perhaps directed at Margot. Poirot took out his research notebook and wrote, Last message from Baron Etienne. I don't trust my own voice. Let Scripture speak for me. The next day, Poirot sent a handwritten letter to Margot, brief but precise. Mademoiselle, you seek certainty. The Baron didn't leave you with words, but with verses. What he couldn't say out loud, he said with ink and fear. I'm not asking you to forgive him, but know that, until the very end, he wanted you to inherit not only his last name, but also his remorse. H.P. That night, Poirot, sitting in his reading chair, lit his lamp and gazed out the window at the city for a moment. Paris shone, unaware that yet another crime had been concluded, not with a trial, but with an understanding. Sometimes, he thought, the final chapter is not written by justice, but by silence, and yet worth reading. Chapter 16. The third version of the oath. In the days following Poirot's letter, Paris remained indifferent, as if the de La Fontaine family's fate were nothing more than a leaf blown by the wind among millions. But far from that indifference, in a small boarding house on the outskirts of Dijon, someone wasn't sleeping. Margot de La Fontaine read and reread the envelope she had received with Poirot's handwriting. She kept it on the table like a sheathed dagger, knowing that what it contained could no longer be unread. That message didn't bother her because of what it said, but because, as she said it, for the first time in her life, someone wasn't treating her like an echo of her father, or a victim, or a threat, only as an heir to something more complex, an ambiguous truth, an unsigned guilt. That same night, he wrote a letter. 2 days later, Poirot received it. The envelope was plain, unadorned. It read simply, for the man who read what others left between the lines. The letter, handwritten in blue ink, unfolded with a firm hand. Mr. Poirot, as a child, I learned that silence was the only way to maintain dignity, that speaking was opening the door to judgment, and crying was an excuse to be ignored. I grew up in a home where every word seemed to carry more weight than actions, where whispers weren't secrets but tools. My father was a man with a powerful gaze and vague morals. I adored him, then I feared him, and finally I turned him into a statue so I wouldn't have to argue with his shadow. Your letter made me understand something essential. I, too, was part of the silence. I, too, swore, twice. Once, when I said I didn't remember the night my mother died, and another when I pretended I no longer cared. Both were lies. I remember everything, and I care more than I want to admit. Thank you for not saving me, but for showing me that I could choose not to repeat history. Margot de la Fontaine. Poirot, when he finished reading, didn't stand up. He didn't sigh. He just folded the letter and placed it next to the Baron's, forming a mirror of confessions between father and daughter. That afternoon, Ariel also wrote from a discreet pension in Aix-en-Provence. She had adopted a new name to escape the headlines and provincial whispers, but she couldn't escape herself. His letter also reached Poirot. Sir, I haven't forgiven myself, and I don't expect you to, but I want you to know this. I knew Etienne was falling apart, but I thought it wasn't my place to stop him. I believed the truth was his, and his alone. Now I understand that when you live with a truth and don't face it, you become an accomplice. Didn't lie, not directly, but I hid behind the language of half-truths. Today, I live with less security, with fewer comforts, but also with less fear. I've started teaching music to girls who talk too loudly and aren't afraid to ask questions. Maybe that's a kind of justice too, with respect. EAD. Poirot placed both letters side by side on the mantelpiece in his study. He looked at them silently for several minutes. Then he took out his notebook and wrote a final entry under the title of the case. The woman who swore differently twice was not just one. Margot swore she didn't remember. Ariel swore she didn't suspect. And the Baron swore that he did it for love. But they all lied, as those who still don't know how to live with the truth lie. In the end, it was the third version that freed everyone, the one that was not said out loud, the one that was only written to be read with the heart. That evening, Poirot indulged himself in something unusual. A walk along the Seine at dusk, without a cane, unhurried. He watched as the lanterns began to reflect on the water. Justice, he thought, doesn't always come in the form of a trial. Sometimes it comes as a letter written in blue ink, and with a slight smile, he disappeared among the strollers of Paris, invisible by choice, like a gardener who no longer needs to prune, because the flowers have started to grow on their own. Chapter 17. The Echo in the Wooden Box. Poirot's apartment on the Rue des Martyrs was wrapped in meticulous calm. Every surface gleamed, every object remained exactly where it should be. And yet, amidst that perfection, something didn't quite fit. An unmarked wooden box, delivered that same morning without a note, without a sender, just a wax seal with a withered flower stamped in red wax. Poirot stared at it for a long time, as if by looking at it closely enough he could deduce its contents without opening it. But no, finally, with slow hands, he cut the seal with an ivory knife he kept for such ceremonial gestures. Inside, there were 3 things: a small notebook, bound in light grey leather, a gold pen engraved with EDLF, and a yellow envelope with his full name written in such familiar handwriting that it made Poirot close his eyes for a moment. Margot Era. The letter was short, but no less powerful for that. Mr. Poirot, I've decided to leave, not to escape, but to discover what my voice sounds like when it's not trapped within the walls of an inheritance. I've left behind the castle, the documents, even the name. In this box is everything that ties me to de la Fontaine. The notebook belongs to Claire. I found it tucked into a false bottom in the desk you didn't check. Maybe by choice, maybe by fate. I haven't read it all. I don't have the strength, but I'm sure you have. And if you find anything that still needs to be known, you already know what to do. Monsieur Poirot put the letter aside and held up the notebook. It was old, the pages somewhat brittle, but perfectly legible. On the first page, in ink from another century, was the following: Claire de la Fontaine's diary. He opened a random entry and read, Etienne stares at me like I'm a threat wrapped in lace. He says he loves me, but he keeps all his emotions locked away, like his weapons. Sometimes I wonder if what he hates in me is what he sees of himself when he looks at me. Poirot closed the notebook, not for lack of interest, but for a silent fear. I knew, from experience and instinct, that inside that diary there were not only memories. There were keys, and if he used them, he would open a new labyrinth of truths that perhaps they did not want to be dug up. That night, he ate dinner in silence. He didn't touch his notebook for hours, but at the stroke of midnight, he turned on his reading lamp, sat down in his velvet armchair, and rested his notebook. On his knees, he opened it again, this time from the beginning. I married Etienne knowing he didn't love me. He chose me like one chooses a solid table for their living room, one that doesn't wobble, one that doesn't make demands, one that doesn't speak. But I spoke, first in a low voice, then with music, and when he still wouldn't listen, I started writing. This diary is my confession, not of a crime, but of a warning. Poirot let the words float in the darkness. Claire, the woman erased from family history, had left her voice embedded in the wood of a desk. And now that voice returned, not as I scream, but as an echo. And in that echo, Poirot sensed something else, something that still had not been fully revealed. The next day, Poirot sent an urgent letter to the notary Levis. I need access to any private manuscripts belonging to Claire de la Fontaine, letters, books, music, especially what was filed as not relevant. Don't underestimate what law enforcement once considered irrational. H. Poirot. Then he returned to his desk and placed his notebook on the lectern, and he whispered, So, Mrs. Claire, let us. Outside, Paris continued with its indifferent bustle. But in a small study, a Belgian detective was preparing to listen to a dead woman, and this time it wouldn't be a matter of justice, but of memory. Chapter 18. The Secret of the Last Note. For 3 full days, Hercule Poirot didn't leave his apartment except to pace his living room, meticulously arrange his cups, or feed the pigeons perched on the windowsill. But his real focus wasn't on the rituals. It was on Claire de la Fontaine's notebook. Each night, like a violinist tuning his ear to the limits of silence, Poirot read a section slowly, letting the rhythm of the writing reveal more than the words themselves, and in the penultimate entry, everything changed. He took my music away from me. He forbade me from playing, composing, even teaching. He said the piano drove me crazy. But what drove me crazy was its silence. So I hid my voice where no one would know how to find it. In the requiem I wrote last night, the notes say it all. There is no confession more exact than a dissonance. One day, someone with a real ear will know how to read it. Poirot straightened in his seat. The requiem, he murmured. The musical manuscript. The next day, he immediately went to Levis's notary office. After several formal exchanges and a reminder of his reputation, the notary agreed to give him a box labelled Personal Sheet Music, Claire DLF. Inside were several compositions, waltzes, short piano pieces, and in the background a long score, on aged paper, but with ink still firm. Requiem in C minor. C de la Fontaine Poirot immediately took him to an old acquaintance, the maestro Auguste Morel, a retired musician with perfect pitch and an infallible memory. In his studio, surrounded by upright pianos and heavy rugs, Morel read the score silently for over half an hour. His fingers moved in the air, recreating chords without playing them. When he finished, he said, "This isn't just music, it's a hidden message. Look here, and here. The notes form words, not all of them, of course. But if you look at the beginning of each measure of the second movement." Poirot bowed. There, in a seemingly random sequence, a sentence was formed in Old French. "I didn't fall. I didn't fall." Morel looked at him in bewilderment. "Do you think it means anything, sir?" Nodded very slowly. "A lot. It means that Claire's death, it was not an accident, not a suicide. Claire was pushed. And before he died, he wanted to make sure the world knew it. But not with words, with music." Poirot returned to Paris that night with a new weight on his shoulders. Not because he feared what he had discovered, but because of the question that burned like a small but constant flame. Who pushed her? He reread the diary, now with that certainty. And then, among Claire's last words, he found what he hadn't been able to see before. Margot had started playing the piano like me. But Etienne said he had no ear, that he did it to please me. I believe his ear was perfect, so much so that he detected my pain in the music before it detected it in my words. One night she heard me crying over the keys, and the next day she locked herself away for hours. He thought he had punished her. I knew I had turned it on. Poirot closed the diary. Everything fell into place now. 2 weeks later, he received a letter from Rome sender, Margot D. Mr. Poirot. In the church of St. Cecilia, I found an antique piano. I've started playing again. And the funny thing is that, for the first time, I'm not doing it to say what I can't say, but to remember what I no longer need to carry. I found your letter. I know what Claire wrote, and I also know what you understood, and he didn't say. Thank you for not making my truth an accusation. There are times when knowing is enough. M. Poirot folded the letter, and as the spring sun illuminated the corners of his study, he made a final entry in his notebook. The case of the woman who swore differently twice did not begin with a lie. It started with a note held too long. and adieu. It ended not with a confession, but with a liberated melody. Justice is not always a verdict. Sometimes it's the simple act of giving back the voice of someone who has been silenced for generations. Poirot closed the notebook. His perfectly aligned moustache arched in the most subtle of smiles. And that's it. It's over. And that night, as Paris vibrated in its indolent routine, the most meticulous of Belgian detectives allowed his mind, for once, to rest, not with certainties, but with harmony.